This is a good time for people. Start.
I'm starting the recording and I'll mute well, I won't, I don't think I need to mute the people here, but I won't. Okay, alrighty. Lisa?
Great. Welcome. Welcome everybody to the 2021 New Orleans Poetry Festival and today's panel, In and Out of French, a Poetry Translation Roundtable. I'm Lisa Passold from the New Orleans Poetry Fest board. And before we get started, I want to thank our major sponsors this year, especially the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation and the Academy of American Poets, who've helped us keep this year's festival free and open to all. I'm really glad to see you with us at this virtual event, and I hope to see you at some of the others that are taking place in the remainder of the month. We're hosting events, as you all probably know, all through the month of April. And everything is on the website in a handy calendar view with links. And now I'm going to turn the Poetry Translation Roundtable over to Teresa Villa-Ignacio. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jonathan, for hosting us today. I'd also like to shout out to Bill Lavender and Megan Burns for organizing the festival wonderfully as always. And also to Laura Mullen, who was a great supporter of this particular roundtable in its infancy over 2 years ago. So I'm just going to very, very quickly introduce our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking, which is a little bit different from the way they're listed. We are listed on the website in that I will speak last. So first is Lindsay Turner, the author of Songs and Ballads from Prelude Books, 2018. Her translations from the French include Adagio Monotropo by Ryoko Sekiguchi from Les Figues in 2018. The Next Loves by Stéphane Bouquet, Nightboat Books, 2019, as well as several books of contemporary philosophy. She's the recipient of a 2017 French Voices grant for her translation of Stéphane Bouquet's Common Life, forthcoming from Nightboat in 2022. Originally from Northeast Tennessee, as she just mentioned, she holds an AB from Harvard College, a master's in cinema from the Université Paris 3, Sorbonne Nouvelle, an MFA in poetry from New York University, and a PhD in English from the University of Virginia. She's assistant professor of English and creative writing at the University of Denver. Cole Swenson will speak next after Lindsay. She's the author of 19 books of poetry, most of them focused on visual arts, land use issues, and their intersection in the arrangement and depiction of public space. A former Guggenheim Fellow, recipient of the National Poetry Series, the Iowa Poetry Prize, the San Francisco State Poetry Center Book Award, and finalist for the National Book Award, she has edited a number of anthologies and organized reading series focused on aesthetic experimentation. She's a prolific translator of poetry, prose, and art criticism from the French, and is the founding editor of La Presse Books, which specializes in contemporary experimental French writing translated by English language poets. Her newest book, Art in Time, a series of 20 poem essays on innovative landscape art, bless you, Cole, is forthcoming from Nightboat on May 1st. She teaches at Brown University. Kevin Holden is a poet, translator, and essayist. His books include Solar, which won the Fence Modern Poets Prize, Birch, which won the Sata Press Chapbook Award, and Pink Noise, forthcoming from Nightboat Books. His writing has appeared in publications such as Conjunctions, Lana Turner, and The New Yorker, and in anthologies including the Arcadia Project, If Bees Are Few, and Best American Experimental Writing. His work focuses on queer experience, ethics, and the ecological, and he translates from French, German, and Russian. He is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. And I am a literary translator and scholar working on contemporary poetics and translation studies. My translation projects include Souffle and Fas, a critical anthology from the Moroccan Journal of Culture and Politics from Stanford University Press, 2016, and Clamor by Oussine Tanjawi, an autobiographical prose poem that recounts the author's initiation into the world's musical traditions during his childhood during the Algerian War, which is forthcoming in a bilingual edition from Litmus Press at the end of the month. I teach at Stonehill College. I'm really bad at multitasking, so I'm just checking the chat, everything's okay. So I should also just say, really the point of this is for us to kind of talk about what we're all working on right now. Thank you, Laura. And really to hear what you all are thinking. It's really going to be, maybe 10 minutes at most from each person, and then we'll open for questions and general discussion. And I forgot to ask, I know Kevin isn't sharing anything. Cole, Lindsay, are you going to share your screens at all? Okay.
I'll share my screen briefly.
Okay, so Jonathan can turn that on for you. I'm going to mute. Lindsay, go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Teresa. It's such a pleasure to be here and to see all of you. I've been looking forward to this for such a long time, and I can only wish that we were all in New Orleans or in Paris, but it's nonetheless, it's really, really great to be here. So let me pull up, I have too many windows open. I'll pull up my remarks. So I'm working on a few things right now. A couple of books of philosophy and a couple of books of poetry. But as Teresa mentioned, Stefan's next book, Common Life, is coming out sometime, I think in 2022. I believe I turn in a final draft at the end of this summer. So I'm going back to some of that work. And I thought I would talk a little bit about Stéphane Bouquet's work following our title In and Out of French, because I think his work goes back and forth between English and French in some really interesting ways. And I was thinking actually about translation and time, and I thought I would use Stéfan's work to talk a little bit about the weird temporalities of translation. And so right now I'm also teaching for the very first time a graduate seminar on the sort of theory and practice of literary translation, which has been really fun for me. This is not a class I have ever taken, so it's really been starting from scratch and going through some of the basics of translation theory. And so we've just been revisiting Walter Benjamin's essay, The Task of the Translator, or The Translator's Task, depending on how you translate it. So I've been thinking about how Benjamin, like many others, thinks of translation as a translation is occurring after the original text in time, or the afterlife of the original text. And this way of thinking about translation makes, I think, intuitive sense to most of us. Like, of course, translation has to come after the original text, and it represents its future, the future of that original, or the expansion of that text to new readers. But this is actually not how I've been thinking about Stéfan's text necessarily, and I'm not really going to talk about my translation into English as an afterlife of Bouquet's work, not only because Bouquet is very much living and producing, but also because I'm going to be thinking a little bit about Bouquet's relationship to the New York School of Poets who have influenced him so much. And I think we might be able to see Stéphane Bouquet's work as a version of the afterlife of those poets, and the generation of a new future for those older American poets that's built up from a kind of series of acts of writing and translation. And for me, this makes translating Bouquet into English even more special, because it feels a little like a return and a little like a rebirth, and a little like the activation of a potential of some original text that Benjamin describes. So here the original is the New York School, and the translation is Bouquet's work going into English. But before I get into that, I'll back up a little bit and briefly introduce Stéphane Bouquet and his work. And I know some of you know the poet, know the person and the work very well. And some of you have heard me talk about him before, and I apologize, but I'm hoping that there might be some people here who are unfamiliar with his work. So Stéphane Bouquet was born in 1968 to a French mother and an American father. Bouquet's range is very wide. He studied economics at university before working for almost a decade as a literature and film journalist, as an editor at the Cahiers du Cinéma, as well as La Libération and France Culture. He's a screenwriter, notably for the acclaimed gay films Wild Side and Come Undone with Sebastian Lifshitz. And he's written books on the filmmakers Pier Paolo Pasolini, Gus Van Sant, Sergei Eisenstein, and Clint Eastwood. He's a dancer and choreographer as well. He's worked with the archives at the Centre National de la Danse in Paris. And finally, he's the translator of books by Peter Gizzi, Robert Creeley, Paul Blackburn, and James Schuyler, among others, those last three all being part of the New York School. And so what first drew me to Bouquet's work, I still remember very vividly the first time I heard him read, it was with Cole in a bookstore. What first drew me to Bouquet's work was that it seemed to me the first time I heard it, and it still seems to me, to strike like a note or a tone or a pose that is quite different from a lot of contemporary French production. It's closer to the chattier or thingier or sort of more daily and more bodily register of O'Hara, Blackburn, Schuyler, and similar poets. And I've described, in other venues, I've described the process of translating Bouquet's work as involving the guilty sensation of sort of putting the poems back in English, as if they'd somehow been there before. And so just as an example of what this poetry is, to get some of it in the air, let's see if I can share my screen. Whoops. I feel like I spend a lot of my time now doing that. Let's see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully you all, hopefully you all see a poem. Okay, so this is one of the sonnets from Bouquet's work, The Next Loves, and I'll read it. This is my favorite sonnet. I think it's my favorite sonnet from the book. Red t-shirt and husky voice, we do yoga together, much less strong than I am, but so much more beautiful. At the end in Savasana, when we're supposed to become one of those vibrations in the air, and the ritual bell sets us almost behind absence, I can only think like an animal of slim desire stretched out 2 meters away. If I roll over on him, really would that from on be the only hope of slowing, because of the sweetness in your bones, the quickness of death against which I recite, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. Sure. So I should tell you before I say anything else that the Gertrude Stein at the end that some of you might recognize is my American edition. In French, it's actually a gesture towards Ronsard. The line is Mignon allons voir si la rose. And the title of Ronsard's sequence, Les Amours, is what Bouquet borrows for the sequence and also for the book's title. But even with that Ronsard, I think it's fair to say that the poem has kind of an American accent. So the prosy details of the red t-shirt, the very contemporary and maybe non-Parisian scene of 2 men at a yoga class, the gently giddy fantasy of simply rolling over onto your companion in that yoga class, these make the sonnet into a crucible for desire in very typical sonnet operations, but it's a quotidian one, and it's full of stuff and substance and observation in a way that seems to me, again, to generalize, to draw heavily on certain tones and traditions of American poetry. So as many possible examples of similar poems, here's the opening from another poem featuring a bright t-shirt. Frank O'Hara's Having a Coke with You, which I'm sure many of you know. Having a Coke with you, O'Hara writes, is even more fun than going to San Sebastian, Irún, Hendaye, Biarritz, Bayonne, or being sick to my stomach on the Travesera de Gracia in Barcelona. Partly because in your orange shirt, you look like a better, happier San Sebastian, partly because of my love for you, partly because of your love for yogurt, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's clear that the energies of this poem, at least, live on in Bouquet's work in French and then are revived in English with this translation of Bouquet's work. And here's another quick example of another sonnet in which the infusion of the New York school into Bouquet's work is, I think, even more explicit. Share screen again. So this is the penultimate poem of this particular sonnet sequence. On Facebook, someone posted, and thanks, a youthful face reading a poem, Soonest Mended, it was called. Will be soonest mended if and only if you come closer saying the words. We are all chatty, it's true, but under the talk, solutions lie everywhere, intertwined from the outset. I start you over on repeat, bright reader of the poem, Adam Fitzgerald, as it were. Everything is verifiable, lasts 4 minutes, 51 seconds. You're speaking, you're saying with and sometimes without. Solitary and hopeless, and still everything's reassuring because of your scarf around your neck, because of the world from now on and from now on real. See, I'll keep sharing. Too many tabs. So the connection here is obvious. Via Facebook, the French poet encounters John Ashbery's poem, soon as mended via a video on YouTube. And the next poem in the sequence is actually about the comments below, below the sequence, and there's lots more to say about that poem. But in the interest of time, I think I just want to point out how very living this connection is, how this afterlife might not even be the right word here, but just simply life. Because this YouTube video is a real video, and Ashbery's poem is read by the real American poet Adam Fitzgerald, who, let's see, who is still very much here in the world of poetry. And here is a screenshot of this video. I thought about pulling it up, but sometimes it starts auto-playing. So you can see everything is indeed verifiable. It's actually 4 minutes and 50 seconds. And there's a scarf around Adam Fitzgerald's neck. And if we wanted, we could listen to this right now. And I'll put that, after I'm done, I'll put the link in the chat just in case you're interested. With this translation into English, the two poems are now even closer together. They're in the same language. And one could imagine a sort of this poem leading to a real life encounter. It's very close to that what it describes is much closer actually to a real life encounter. So in gesturing, and this would be a kind of longer thing I have said about Stéphane Bouquet before, but rather than thinking about the act of translation as something like an afterlife, we could also think about it as close to what Jose Munoz calls a futurity. Which he describes as a quote, field of utopian possibility in which multiple forms of belonging and difference. So here the differences are across nationality and generation and level of mediation, adhere to belonging in a collectivity. So in any case, I think what I want to stress is that this interplay in and out of French becomes the platform for bringing the afterlife of a school of poetry into being and for bringing about new relationships between people. This motion in and out of French brings writers and texts of the past together and brings real living writers, texts, and readers of the present and the future into being and to togetherness, I suppose, as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was wonderful. Without further ado, let us move on to Cole Swinson.
Cole, I hit S to oh, there you are. And you're still muted. Okay. I hit S.
Okay, great, good, thank you. Hit the wrong button. Thank you, Teresa, for putting this together, and just so nice to finally actually be here. And thank you to Bill Lavender and to Jonathan and to Lisa and everyone for all the organizing work. Really, really appreciated that. I'm going to, as usual, kind of not do what I was asked to do with apologies. I was just thinking about some sort of very general things. And so I'm just going to make some general observations and then talk a little bit about what I'm working on now. I was thinking about translation as a field that's especially pertinent to the contemporary moment because it's essentially simply a study of difference. And it offers a perfect lens through which to think about difference, not only in this specific practice, but across the board. And as a negotiation of difference and differences is one of the most pressing issues in the world today, translation and translation studies have ramifications far beyond the literary and linguistic fields. Among them is the fact that translation can open up ways of thinking about difference differently. Translation sheds light not so much on the varying degrees and qualities of difference, but on its operations, how difference works. In translation, difference is always the moving part, the machine that makes it all happen. And as such, it shows difference itself to be a functioning machine, a catalyst to cause a a catalyst to a causative dynamic. I'm also thinking of differential, and I'm thinking of it in its most mechanical sense, which is the one I find most appropriate and most parallel to translation. Differential, like the one in the gearbox of a car that allows, quote, different drive wheels on the same axle to rotate at different speeds, which, for instance, is what allows a car to turn a corner. The parallels with translation are boundless and yet impossible to cleanly articulate, so they remain productively unsettled. Translation focuses, of course, not just on linguistic difference. It famously shows up all sorts of other differences based in history, culture, values. Does translating them through language leave those things untouched? Or are they fundamentally changed just as the words are? The translation lens also underscores the degree to which all differences, cultural, historical, etc., are themselves linguistically based. So while translation ostensibly claims to span difference, to collapse it into equalities, its much more productive work is in exposing irreconcilable differences and framing the ways in which language is at the root of those differences. That said, because translation is always moving outward, ever unfolding, it does create links and bridges, interweaving the networks established by each language, and in so doing, it erodes linguistic boundaries. And because they are so often also political boundaries, translation is also always a political act. Returning for a moment to translation as a laboratory for exploring difference, one reason that it's particularly effective is that it often works with difference on the smallest of scales. And the slighter the difference, the closer you have to peer at it, and the more clearly you could see exactly how the difference is operating. This is what happens with French to English translation or vice versa, because the two languages are relatively close, sharing common roots and having hundreds of cognates. For those of us who are not natively bilingual, the second language, the one we're translating out of, retains a greater physicality than the native language. You simply can't look through it as you can a word or phrase in your native language. It cannot become a mere vehicle. Its material quality, its quality as an art material, always remains apparent. I tend to translate work whose physicality really stands out to me, almost obstructs me, works I can't read with easy accessibility. I like the physical encounter that they demand, the sense of grappling with a solid substance, and it lets me feel, once again, the thickness of all language, its tremendous depth, not a thin sheen over the world out there, but, to quote Oppen, a thing among the things of that world, insoluble. And I'll just say a little bit about, I always, for years, I've been translating the same people, and I have done any number of books by each of them. Currently, I'm working on ones by Olivier Cadio, Jean Frémont, Nicolas Pesquez, Didier Borda, and Suzanne Dopelt. And I'm just starting on a new book of Suzanne Dopelt's, and kind of as she's writing it, I'm translating it. And my relationship with Suzanne has been a really great one because we're always doing the same thing. And she'll say one day, "So what are you working on?" I'll say, "A book about ghosts." And she'll say, "Ah, I'm working on a book about ghosts too." And I'll say, "So what are you working on these days?" She said, "Well, I'm doing this thing on gardens." "What are you working on?" "I'm doing this thing on gardens." So there's this wonderful kind of accidental reciprocity in many of our projects. And her current project is a series of texts based on animals in visual art. And so it obviously overlaps with a number of my own interests too. But the one I just did is on cave drawings of these two horses in a cave. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you all also for respecting time. This is awesome. Let us move on to Kevin Holden.
Hi, so I express the same thanks to the same people for the same or similar things. It is really great to see you, the other presenters and people, friends I know far away, and like we were saying before, whom we normally would have likely seen last summer maybe, or this coming summer. And I think clearly many of us last summer thought that we would be seeing one another this summer, and unfortunately that is most likely not the case. So it is lovely to kind of converge in this way. So my trajectory is a little bit more like, is like Cole's kind of, insofar as I wanted to just say some things about my experience of translation, and just also some ideas I sort of have or feel about translation itself and things that it does. And then I can talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing as well. I guess the two kind of topics that I wanted to talk about first are sort of like an experience of language that happens when you're translating. And then the other topic be a little bit about ways of translating and sort of like the notion of fidelity, maybe to trouble that notion a little bit. So the first thing, and I think what I'm about to say right now about what happens in translation is probably very familiar to many of us who translate. And so it's perhaps somewhat obvious, but maybe I can kind of exfoliate it a little bit. So which is to say, I find often when translating and coming across phrases, then there's the process of trying to figure out how you're going to convey that, right? And you start playing around with effectively things like synonyms or parallel phrases or words. And for me, this often just produces a totally kind of amazing thing where you start to see the substrata of a language, and you see your own language sort of in reverse. So you're looking at some sort of idiom and you're like, oh wait, that's why it's like this in English. And I will say that I think perhaps this is particularly true of French because our languages are so close that there's just obviously so much French in our language. But it is a kind of amazing feeling to see these sort of constructions and phrases where you're suddenly like, oh, that's sort of like a literal version or a metaphorical version. And they kind of go back and forth. Like an example, sort of an example would be the verb like trouver and the reflexive like se trouver, which just is so frequently used, like if to say like an opinion, je me trouve que something, or a thing is found, like is located, like something se trouve in a city. And we can say that in English. We might say like, I find him to be a very nice person, or you can find this library in this neighborhood, but we often don't, right? We would say, I think that something, or it is there. And so se trouver can replace those. But you realize like, oh no, but we can do that in English, and we do. It just feels a little bit more formal, at least in this moment. So there's a kind of slight anachronism, but it shows you sort of like what something can be or mean. And I would say that in a way, when you're in this space doing that, translating, finding these sort of parallel phrases or metaphors, it can be kind of like vertiginous, and you almost lose a sense of the original meaning in your own language. And I think that this is a productive and sort of beautiful thing. And I think it relates a little bit perhaps to what Lindsay's describing about kind of in and out of time, but not so much epical or historical time, but something like that happens about the sort of substrata of language, not just etymologically, but in your own perception. And I think in a way, and again, maybe this is particularly true in French, I think it troubles a little bit of the notion of origin and destination language. And it makes me think of something like a language in between languages, and which is incidentally, I was just reading Werner Hamacher's new book, or posthumously collected book of essays from 2020, in which he talks about things like this, actually, like languages in between languages, and languages that on one hand, no one speaks, and on the other hand, everyone speaks. And I do think that some of this is germane to what Cole is talking about difference, that this act of translation, on one hand, it opens you to a kind of alterity, that something isn't assimilable back. And on the other hand, it opens up these sorts of bridges. And I think a lot of that can just happen in the mind's relationship to these languages, but that has a kind of ethical push to it about coming to a kind of difference. And it reminds me, for instance, of this thing that Barbara Johnson writes. I think it's in an essay about Barthes, where she says that reading is often an experience of recognition at first. So you read something, you're like, oh, I know that, I've seen that, I've had that thought. And that it's upon rereading that you start to see difference. And she says it's sort of, you start to see what you didn't know, right? And I think that's an ethical activity. And I think that it is a kind of, there's another way to look at it would be something like, if the Wittgensteinian kind of notion, like if the limits of my thought are the limits, the limits of my language are the limits of my thought or my world, then in a way this starts to push that. But it shows, as I say, it sort of, on one hand, it extends that circumference a little bit, but at the same time pays a kind of, I guess you could say, respect to the sort of alterity, I think. So that's one thing. That's a somewhat, I guess, philosophical reflection on this notion of like experiencing the substrata of languages, for lack of a better word, and proximity. There are other examples. I mean, I used the reflexive of trouver, but I was thinking just, and another one that I think very well known is like hasard, right? Chance, and something like we would say happenstance, and in English, and maybe hasard. And in a way, it's not our hazard, but it is like our to hazard a guess, right? An attempt, a possibility, something like contingency. But then if you were to say to hazard a guess in French, like if I had to hazard a guess, you might say like, si je devais deviner, right? Deviner, right? And like, then you get to this whole question of like divination. I mean, you see these sort of loops, and you're like, oh, right, that is what chance is. It's sort of augury, like, that's kind of cool. So the second topic, and I'll just speak briefly because I don't know how long I've been going, maybe 8 minutes, but I don't know. Is just this notion of I guess I could just say my own processes of translation, which I think have say something about fidelity, which is that I notice that when I'm translating, I wouldn't say there's a single mode of translation. Like I'm not just sort of like, I want this to be very literal, or I want this to sound right. I think we all kind of know this a bit, or I want this to just have the idea of it. But for me anyway, I noticed that in a way, approaching that original text, there are like multiple access points depending on the lines or a given some sort of cluster of lines, where I'm like, okay, this time I'm going to try to pinpoint more indexically as to what this might be literally. And then other times it's more of the feel of it or the idea. And then I was thinking that I should say, I wondered, this might be particularly true of the kind of work that I translate, which is often long poems that are sometimes, in still sections, or when you have little parts that are separated, say, by dots. So maybe having something longer is more conducive to, okay, this time I'm going to do it this way, because it's almost like guerrilla tactics or something, because this feels more right. And then another time, okay, this. And so the book I've been translating for a while, from which I took a break, a very long break, then returned, is this book by Jean Dève called L'Énonciateur des Extrêmes. But other people I've translated, like Eric Uzer and Vincent Brocard, like the things that I've translated are also long. So, which is the poetry I'm often drawn to, and which I myself write. And so, as I say, that kind of packet of strategy, as it were, might be more germane to that. So I guess I could stop there and just, I mean, I wonder about that mode. And if, I think sometimes that, or this multiplicity of mode, like I'm describing, because I think sometimes I wonder if people feel that, because I think, again, I keep repeating myself, but I think sometimes there are authors where the point is very much, is more, I mean, translators, where there's more of a uniformity. And sometimes that has to do with sort of wanting to create that text in the kind of like their, so the biggest example I could think of maybe would be like Seamus Heaney's Beowulf, which in many ways, the interest is to have it in Heaney's voice, or maybe even some of John Ashbery's translations of French, or Anne Carson's translations from Greek, where you want that. And it's a kind of, it's more liberal, you could say, and it just produces a different object. And I wonder, I don't know what their processes, but that a kind of stepping back into, funnily, a kind of parallel mode, or like scroll. Anyway, so I think I'll stop with those thoughts. So.
Thank you, Kevin. It's actually good that I'm following you, because I think I've actually been thinking a lot about polyphony and multiplicity in translation. And so this also, I think, touches on what Cole and Lindsay were talking about too. But I'm actually going to go in a totally very different direction. But I'm glad that everyone is bringing up these ways of thinking about translation, because I think we can all have a lot to say about them. So I'm going to hide behind a PowerPoint, because I like to do that. And I spend a lot of time teaching on Zoom. So anytime I can hide behind a PowerPoint, I will. And I will try not to speak for too long. So I just want to talk about one very specific problem that I have right now, which is not, a problematic problem. It's a joy and it's a privilege to have this problem. So when I use the word problem, I don't mean it in any kind of negative way. I think you guys know that. So I'm also not doing what I actually called everyone to do, which is to talk about poetry. So I'm actually going to talk about a novel, but it is by a poet. So there's that. It's a posthumous novel. You can see on the right the French cover, La Mezzanine, Le Dernier Récit de Catarina Kia, which I'm translating as The Mezzanine, the Last Account of Catarina Kia. So this is a work in progress. Let's see if I can, sorry. Okay, there we go. So I think a lot of you in the room know Anne-Marie Biac's work pretty well. These are 3 of her major texts, which have all been translated into English. I've read her for a very long time, and I'm writing about her. And so it's of all of the poets in all of the world, this is perhaps the person and the poet whom I would least like to reduce to a 2-sentence summary. But maybe one thing I could say about her that's helpful. She started writing the 60s at the same time as all of these things were going on in France, with tel quel and the post-structuralists, and also the new wave, right? The nouvelle vague in film, and the nouveau roman, the new novel in literature. And you can think of the 60s as a revolutionary time politically, which it was, but I think also aesthetically, there's a lot of work in terms of stripping down, right? And in terms of really putting into question, how does representation work? How can we move beyond representation in our poetry, in our novels, in our films? What alternatives exist beyond representation? So this novel, which was written in the 80s in a series of notebooks that were given to Anne-Marie Biac's husband, and then no longer husband at the time, Claude Royer-Journoux. What is this? It's a novel. Again, I don't really want to reduce it because it's so interesting, but so like the things that are important for what I'm going to share with you presently is that there is a female narrator, or possibly female narrators, which I'll come back to in a second, who are spending some time in a psychiatric hospital in Paris. And so you're probably aware that one of the ideas of institutional care, right, in general, is that the patient is kind of separated from all of their things and their familiar environment, which is supposed to be helpful in recovering from whatever trauma they're recovering from. But in this particular case, that kind of deprivation of her things and her surroundings is contributing to the narrator's difficulty in recovery. And then just really quickly, another thing that's very interesting about this text, if you haven't read it, if you're a person who reads in French, I really recommend it. It's fascinating. it alternates between first and third person, sometimes within the same sentence. So you think you're reading, a kind of autobiographical or whatever, at least a text that, has some kind of first person authenticity to it. And then suddenly it switches into third person, and there's suddenly this character that's being developed. And then it goes back and forth, and it's kind of disorienting. And so there is also a kind of element of like a personal journal genre and then the novel genre going on back and forth. So that's additionally disturbing and confusing. So I'm just going to show you, I want to talk about this one word, dénouement, okay, which we could literally translate as denuding, okay. So, and also, again, this is a work in progress. So there, you may see other things in bold that are not perfect, and I'm happy to take any suggestions. But so it's not dénouement, right? If you look at in the French, un dénouement qui éclate. So dénouement I've translated into English. I haven't translated, but I've left it in the French because we know it in English, right? As the ending, right, of a play or a text, right, and literally an unknotting, right? So a dénouement is from nu, right, from nude, becoming nude. But another way this word is used in French would be the way that it's used that could be translated more accurately is a kind of destitution, right, which means just the very thing I was talking about, like being deprived of one's worldly goods, one's possessions, when being made poor, being made miserable or impoverished, right? We talk about someone being destitute and the destitution of a person, right? So that's one way I could translate this. And then, so then this word appears again. And here I want to translate it as dispossession, right? Because here's possession alternating with dispossession. And then it appears one more time when the narrator in the first person this time is talking about not having a child ever in her life. Here I want to translate it as deprivation, right? So I feel like these three translational choices come closest, I think, to conveying the sense, right, of what's actually happening in that micro moment, or those three micro moments in the text. But now, I'll show you this slide where so I mean, I guess the previous slide, right? The problem with that is that you don't get the sense that, oh, it's actually the same word being repeated, right? So here I am repeating the same word, but then it just, it becomes too much and too little in some places, right? Maybe it's fine for the first one, but then for the second excerpt, right? Possession alternated with destitution might be too strong there. And then the third time, a destitution, then it just feels repetitive, right? It might not be the right sense, but so I guess I'm not, I haven't made a decision about this, and I think this kind of decision needs to be made in the context of translating the entire book and thinking about it. One thing that also did occur to me, some of you may be familiar with Heidegger's essay, What Are Poets For?, which begins famously, right? What are poets for in a destitute time, right? And do I really want the echoes of that? I'm not sure that that's really, or, is using that word that many times really going to create those echoes? I don't know. So that's kind of an issue that I'm thinking about. And I guess it kind of also made me think about how I think about translation and what's gained in translation. And I think, like Kevin, I will use any tactics, guerrilla or whatsoever. I like to let the text tell me, right, what tactics I should use. And I always think about what's gained in translation. I tell my students to think about, don't think about what's lost in translation, think about what's gained in translation. But this particular problem of the dénouement or the destitution is making me think about, well, actually, why don't I go all the way to the other side? Why don't I think about what do I lose in translation? Why don't I go strip down to the very bare minimum of what I can barely hold on to, and have that be when I'm translating. So that's kind of a new tactic that I may or may not explore. So here we go. So that's it. Thank you all for listening to us. And I would love to open the floor for questions and comments. And I have questions, but I don't want to, I know people like to, ask questions of their own panels to get people warmed up, but this is a crowd that's pretty familiar with one another. So please just go ahead. You can raise your hand. Did someone raise their hand? No. Or just speak, please.
I can ask something. Having published a lot of poetry and translation, one of the reasons I started doing that is that poetry and translation was very important to me when I was an adolescent, and when I first started reading people like Neruda and Rimbaud and Baudelaire, and I think in the early 60s it sort of became a fashion to publish facing page translations, where you have the original on the left and the translation on the right, and I just kind of fell in love with it. And I don't know, I just thought I would ask y'all how you feel about it. I was just actually looking at, while you were talking, I was looking at Keith Waldrop's translation of the work of I'm sorry, Eta, and noticing that it's the original is not there, and I don't know, I just you know, I mean, part of me thinks, okay, when you disrupt the flow of kind of a long poem like that by alternating the pages, have you lost something, or indeed have you gained something by seeing the two languages running side by side? In such a situation, I mean, the reader would be very aware, or could be very aware, for example, of different ways to you're translating denouement. Anyway, it's not really a question, but just curious how y'all feel about it.
I'll just leap in quickly here, because I talked with Henri about this very question, and with Claude, and it's an issue that they had very strong feelings about, and it included the idea that, just as you say, Bill, it disrupts the relationships that the writer has established between, and this is more important for Claude's work than for Henri's. Henri saw her work as a long scroll, so the page arrangement demands were very different. Claude would think about how the lines interacted when the book was shut, how they niched into each other, and what kinds of things. So you can't do that. But also, and this comes also from Emmanuel Hocard, who wrote a bit about the idea that this has to be, in this case, a poem in English. It's not a matter of something that's standing in for a poem in French. It's a completely new and English language poem, and that the face en face has a tendency to reinforce the sense that the translation is a stand-in for something that is inaccessible for some reason. So
yeah, can I so that makes complete sense to me. At the same time, I also love the facing translation, and I was thinking that some of the poets I work on or write about or think about a lot, Ceylon being the main one. Like I don't know if I've ever seen a Ceylon book without the facing translation, page. And I don't know exactly why those choices are made, but it's certain authors. So like Mallarmé would be another. It's almost as if there's a notion of the difficult poets sort of requiring this facing, But that seems problematic to me. I just don't really believe in that kind of difficulty for a series of reasons. But at the same time, I will say I like that. And not all the time. And it's lovely to read a book that flows. Certainly if the visual relationship is important between the pages, then that's really important. But I was just thinking a little bit about when I was saying about the different points, the different sort of tactics. And I had meant to say that part of that for me is is bound in the notion of trying to make the new text available in a way. I was thinking what the word would be. It's like accessible, no, not really, like, but available. And so in a way, in my head, it seems like if there are these different ways in, then the reader might see that object from different sides, like a polyhedron or something, and it becomes more available, which is not to say that it's not otherwise, but that, to me, the facing page, it does sort of take away in some respects from it as its object in the new language, but it adds yet another axis to the multidimensional sort of ways in or availability. So sometimes I like it.
I would add that, you know, I think I also grew up on facing page translation, you know, source text editions, and that was really important and informative for me. But I very much also subscribe to Aucard's idea that the book has to exist, you know, in this new language that it's coming into being in. And but I guess I wanted, it made me think about this book I have coming out now, Clamor, which I should have mentioned I translated with Olivia Harrison from Litmus. And you know, at first, well, no, actually, yeah, at first we were just going to do it in English, and then Tracy Grinnell suggested we could do it bilingually, and we actually decided to do that just because the French edition is not super well known. It wasn't put out by a, you know, big press, and we thought this might be a really good opportunity for, you know, English audiences in English, publics in English, but also, you know, for people who wanted to teach it or study it, right? But the way it's coming out is the first half of the book is in English, and then the French is in the back. And it was going to be a flip book, actually, but then that just didn't work out. Not flip like Laura's laughing, you know what I mean? When you turn it, what is that called? Tête brèche, right?
Yeah.
And that just didn't work out with the designer and the production process. But I've seen books like that, like Skyquake, that Ignacio Infante and Michael Leong translated from Temblor del Cielo by Vicente Huidobro, a Chilean poet, I believe. And he actually wrote it in Spanish and French. And so there's like the Spanish and then the French, and then you flip it and it's the English. They make you crazy, at least. Yeah, so, but I kind of like that better, because then you get to have that experience of the text in that language, but then you can have the reference right in your hands if you want it.
I was going to make a plea for the pony, taking it back to Cole's point about difference, which is, if there is some inclusion of the original, you have this sense of, no, it's not a book in English. It is, there is a difference. There is something else that I think is, for me, it's a very exciting encounter. And post Yasusada, it's become a very necessary encounter as well, which I like. That people will say, well, send a translation, but be sure to send the original.
I was going to say to all of this, it's such a complicated question. I think as a translator, I'm very aware of the reasons that I don't like facing page translations, because I think I still worry that someone is going to, that it basically invites a kind of reading where the reader would be sitting there saying like, ooh, let's see if she got this one right, and let's see if she got this one right, and I find myself doing, I find actually facing page translations, even in languages that I don't know, hard to read, because I'm constantly tempted to you know, as I'm reading, and not necessarily, I mean, it's another mode of reading, maybe it's not a bad thing, but I find it hard not to do that kind of, oh, what is it in the original? When I think I would rather, at least at first, you know, read straight through the new book. I published, so the first translation I published was Ryoko Sekiguchi's Adagio Manantropo. And Ryoko, as many of you know, writes in French and Japanese. And so that text existed in French and in Japanese, and I have no Japanese. I translated it from the French, and I was working with Leigh Feig, and someone had the idea. At first someone said, should we do a facing page translation? The book is really short. And I sort of voiced my, you know, maybe I'd rather not do that. And then someone said, well, what about if we did a trilingual edition? What if we included the Japanese and the French and the English? And I really love that idea for, you know, because I felt as though it would kind of assuage my fear about being about the kind of constant active comparison that was going on. It turned out when the book came out, it made me even more nervous, because then there were two versions of the text, and I had no idea what one of them was saying and what ways that the English that I wrote would stand in relation to the Japanese text. But I think that's actually a really, really productive anxiety, to have a text that is outside even the knowledge, for me at least, to have a text that was kind of outside my knowledge, and to be able to say my translation exists in relation to these two languages, and I have no control in many cases of the way it exists in relation to Japanese. So that was really exciting for me.
That reminds me of one of my favorite books that I've ever designed. It's a book called Hearing Your Story, Escuchando tu Historia, by Nabil Fares. So Fares is French Algerian, and he speaks French and Spanish, as do a lot of people in North Africa. And it's because of the varying colonial influences they had there. And so when he started writing this long poem in Spanish, and then he decided that he would translate it into French himself. And so he actually published his own bilingual version, which was on facing pages, sort of, but he found that when he started in with the French, he had a lot more to say for some reason. And those poems ran sometimes twice as long as the Spanish versions. And so when Peter Thompson translated it for me, this is when I was at UNO Press, we decided to do it trilingual. And so it really wasn't a facing page, but it was this threading through of the three languages. And, we came up with like sort of typographical font changes and things like that to sort of help people if they wanted to just follow the English or whatever. But I mean, this was a book where the translation was quite consciously addressing issues of colonialism and, why are we speaking anything but Maghreb, I guess, since he's from Algeria and writing about the Maghreb people. Anyway, that's it's called Hearing Your Story. I think it's out of print, but hopefully I'm going to bring it back out soon.
Can I ask, you mentioned that you brought it out in a sort of trilingual edition, but when you have the translation into English, which language was it translated out of?
He translated the Spanish.
Yeah,
so
I understand that. The original French.
Yeah, which was, I think this was in consultation with Fares himself, which one he should work from, because it would, it's an interesting dilemma. I mean, someone, I guess, could still translate the French, and then you would have a very complicated situation. But it was Fares himself who suggested that both the French and the English pivot from the Spanish. Yeah.
Not sure how much time we have. So I was just going to see if anyone wanted to ask other questions or make other comments. Like, keep going, Bill.
No, don't let me monopolize, please. Anybody else? Yeah.
One of the questions that sort of the numerous talks brought up in various ways, Lindsay's the most directly, when you're talking about texts that are written by authors that are themselves translators, that are themselves writing between one or two or more languages, especially when one of those languages is English, what have you, as translators, those that you spoke, decided to do with that English? I ask this in the sense that I've worked with a group of Italian and French writers, and when we work on things collaboratively and then we translate them, if a text is written with a little bit of Italian, a little bit of French, and the base language is English, and then it's translated into French, the language it's translated into will then be translated back into the English. So, so I was curious, like, Lindsay in particular, you brought that up with Stefan. You said there are a lot of moments already in English. It sounded to me and what you showed us like you kept the English always there. Are there moments when you reverse that process and you put back into French some of the English things that appear in the French text?
With Stefan, yeah, that's a great question. With Stefan, no. In particular, because in the next loves, especially, there's a lot of talk about English being a kind of lingua franca, or a global language. So there's a poem in which the speaker is recounting a love affair that happens in Taiwan between a French speaker and a Taiwanese speaker, and they communicate in English. And I've left that there because it wouldn't make much sense to have them communicating in French, and because I think that the sense of in Stefan's work, English really does exist. He's really thinking about it as this thing that is a global language in a good way, and that it permits communication between people, and so that stays. Although I've kept some of the in French, the English that's in French is a kind of an accented English, or it's clear that it's being spoken by people for whom English is not a native language. I obviously didn't correct that language. So I left it exactly as it appeared. When I translate philosophy, sometimes, sometimes this is an issue too, but mostly that happens. Mostly that is, I'm very grateful for things like footnotes that are usually already in the text. So it is, yeah, it's, I'm thinking about
with books like Jodi Poo, her book that is crossing between languages, or the forthcoming book by Vincent Broca, where it's necessary for that crossover between two languages to be.
That's what I was thinking exactly. When I was thinking of Jodi Poo's a great example where the difference acted out between these two languages, and so then the choice is, do you put it? Do you just swap it? And I can't remember what the text was that I was working with where this problem came up, and I was collaborating, and we chose, the person was a Spanish speaking person that I was collaborating with, or had Spanish as well. And we chose to put it not back into French, but put it into Spanish. So, and that just seemed to create a different kind of dynamic and really lean on the notion of the relative difference in the differential.
This is maybe just adjacent, but in the book that I'm translating, that Jean wrote, it itself is in conversation with Olson and Creeley and their correspondence, and also very much with the Mayan letters. A lot of the book sort of takes place in, as it were, in like Mesoamerica, but there will be references in the text, and also there are endnotes, and the endnotes are, they're often the French translations of Olson and Creeley, right? And I will put in the original. And that's pretty obvious in some ways, except that sometimes, and this almost is like the denouement moment, that if it's in the text, there might be something around the citation that's coming up against that citation that's in translation about shades of meaning or something. And then you obviously have a question. And so with the denouement, like one idea I had about that is maybe sometimes putting two of the synonyms, even though it's only one word in the original, having one and then comma and then the other, maybe. And sometimes I've done that around those things like that a little bit around the citations in the primary text in Jean, is to like, actually, this is the guerrilla thing, kind of like add a word to show somehow what it's trying, what it's touching on in the translated citation.
That's a great idea. And you know, I have this translation workshop where I meet on Zoom, although hopefully maybe one day we'll do it in person again, with some fellow literary translators once a month, and we like each share a page of what we're working on. And people do that. I think that's a great tactic. With this text, I'm wary to. I'm very into the whole stripped down mentality at the moment, but it's definitely worth thinking about. But I really actually just wanted to say that I also vote for endnotes.
I happen to have a harder time adding to something that's a creative text, but I have done this. For example, I did a translation of a text from French into English by Jean-Yves Perret that was about Matsutami, and there were certain Japanese related references or references in the work to the visual art where I did add a few words to help clarify which image or specific. I actually added something in relationship to one of the specific Japanese words that was reused, you know, which I don't think I would have allowed myself to do in a poetry or a poetry translation. But which I worked years ago rereading for Nancy Houston, who would write her books in one language and then rewrite them in the other language and then have them read through both. And one of the things that she had said is that the reason she was, you know, often considered a better translator for her work than, for example, some other people, like there was a little contest, was that she allowed herself to take those kinds of liberties, and therefore, you know, basically saying a translator should. I liked, was it Lindsay who said, when I wrote that, as opposed to when I translated that, I thought that was an excellent moment, which is, you know, I think a really important nuance that, you know, was exciting to hear you say, that I feel like I struggle with as a translator, that liberty.
Yeah, I want to underscore that because I think it's so important. And the idea that we're so conscious about not disturbing sense. We won't change a word. We'll have the kind of deep consideration that you're having, Teresa. And yet we don't think about it when we change sound. We don't put the same emphasis. And I think that's what someone translating her own work can do, is they can make choices to keep sound or to keep other aspects that are non-semantic. And obviously, you know, those are just as important as the semantic, but I, as a translator, also, you know, have a really hard time violating the semantic in order to maintain these other super essential aspects.
Thoughts? Yes. Lisa?
Thinking we should probably wrap up soon. If people have some wrap up question, comment, maybe we should head for that.
Looking forward to seeing and reading all these translations.
Yeah.
Same.
I want to say it's so fun to talk with other translators. I think just because it, as Cole said, the wonderful thing about translation is engaging with the kind of thickness and material of language, and that work you can do by yourself for so long, but then when, you know, especially when you have these problems that just feel like you really are grappling with them, it's so nice to have other people to think along with and think beside. Yeah.
I'm really glad to be unmuted for once so that we can say thank you, and so that we can applaud and have it be heard. So nice. Thank you. What a great
Yeah, thank
panel.
you, all of you. It was really great.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Fabulous way to spend an afternoon.
Thank you all for organizing this amazing festival. And,
Yes.
and
Thank
as
you
I
so
said
much.
at the beginning, for making it work so smoothly. It's just fantastic.
Wow. If that's smooth, I don't want to see rough. But thank you all for you know, it's you that makes the festival. It is, and so
Next year in person.
Thank you.
Yay.
Next in person. Yes. Yes. Thank you guys.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.